Hi, everybody. Welcome to this interview, more of a conversation, really, with Becky and Becky McNutt, and we're going to be discussing a few things, particularly around experiences of school, and also a little bit of depth about school avoidance and so on. And just to introduce Becky, Becky is a 24-year-old late diagnosed autistic ADHDer, has a passion for fantasy fiction, Greek mythology, and neurodivergence. She works for an education charity that provides small group tutoring and mentoring for disadvantaged young people, many of whom have special educational needs and disabilities. Becky is dedicated to celebrating neurodiversity and sharing her experience of being autistic and ADHD to promote inclusivity. As a Fair Education Alliance Youth Steering Group member, Becky collaborates with other young people to advocate for neuro-inclusivity in education. She is particularly focused on addressing the impact of late diagnosis on neurodivergent individuals' school experiences, working to improve attendance, mental health, and overall well-being. Becky aspires to participate in Neurodiversity in Education Week to engage with schools and educational leaders, raise awareness, and create a safe space for learning about neurodiversity inclusion. So, welcome, Becky, and thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. It's a absolute privilege, and like many people that are involved in this, you're very driven by your own personal experience, aren't you? Your own lived experience.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's talk about that a little bit now. About what was school like for you?
Yeah, so I really liked school in some ways. I always really enjoyed learning. I really enjoyed my particular subjects. I liked the structure of the school day, and like the academic validation and all that sort of thing. I was involved in loads of extracurricular things like debate and music groups and things like that. But I did really struggle with my well-being and my mental health at school. I found the school environment really overstimulating, and especially when I got into secondary school. In my earlier high school years, I would get in trouble quite a lot for just little things like being too chatty and talking back and not necessarily understanding that side of like the relationships with my teachers. I was overwhelmed very easily at school. I think that I was able to mask really well a lot of the time, but that burden of masking all the time came out in other ways, like my school attendance and things like that, and my engagement with school. I mean, with the masking, I'd come home from school every day like completely and utterly exhausted and unwell. I'd have to have a nap as soon as I came home from school. I was regularly unwell with sort of aches and pains and headaches and nausea and all sorts that I can now attribute to being just very burned out from masking all the time, and that really affected my mental health. I was a really anxious person, especially progressing into my teenage years. I would often, when I was in school, I'd make excuses to kind of leave the classroom, be that, I need to go to the toilet, I need to go take my medication, I need to go speak to this staff member, and I'd find excuses to be able to leave class so that I could just go like have 10 minutes to myself in the bathroom and like have that quiet space. I think it's really interesting for me because I didn't know that I was neurodivergent in school. So a lot of this stuff, I just thought was me, and it was just, I don't know, something about me. So I was persistently absent from school. I missed quite a lot of school. I had quite an easy excuse to hide my how much I was struggling because I had long-term back problems anyway, so I could kind of use that as an excuse for why I didn't feel able to go to school. But looking back, it was really, I was overstimulated, or I was anxious, or I was panicky, and things that I can now know were probably related to autism and ADHD. But I just didn't feel able to be in that school environment, but none of that felt like a good enough reason to stay home. So, I'd force myself through it as much as I could until I'd end up getting burned out. So I had like a very on-off relationship with school. Overall, I think, I think I really liked learning, but the school environment didn't like me very much. So, yeah.
Now, you were saying earlier about that you had when you were avoiding going to school, you had you were saying you had a back problem, wasn't it? That you were saying,
Yeah.
and you were able to sort of share that was the issue for being off. So why did you choose to do that instead of sharing about the difficulties you are having with the school environment?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to as well, partly because I think partly linked to my autism, I kind of can struggle to identify like things that are causing me to feel really terrible sometimes. So, I'll know that like I'm not doing well, I'm not feeling good, I'm feeling really anxious, but I won't be able to necessarily know why that is. And it just becomes very overwhelming to try identify that. So I think in school as well, because I didn't know that I was autistic, I didn't know about my ADHD, I always just viewed myself as a really sensitive person. And you get that from other people as well. I was known as a very dramatic, very sensitive person, because no one knew that there were other things going on, and it was linked to neurodivergence. And so I think there's a lot of shame for a lot of late diagnosed people as well. I think that there are those views that you've internalized about yourself, and so I think for me it was always easier to I had that excuse. I have this long-term back problem, I've had surgery for it. People will understand that better than me just saying I feel completely overwhelmed and I can't be in this environment anymore and I need to go home, but there's not really a reason for it, when there were reasons for it. I just didn't know what they were.
Yeah, so it was like by sharing that a physical issue is more likely to be believed
Yeah.
than just to say you were simply overwhelmed with the environments and stuff. When I say simply, I'm not minimizing your experience, because it's a lot more than simply, isn't it? When you're feeling overwhelmed, but rather than be feeling that you could say that, even when you're unaware of your neurodivergence, if you don't feel you can say that within that environment, possibly that would you be right in saying that there's a fear of not being believed?
Yeah, definitely, 100%. And I think that's something, that's still present. I think with being late diagnosed as well, people that have known me my whole life, but have known like the masked version of me, are often really surprised when, I tell them that I've got these diagnoses now. And there is still that underlying thing, like everyone's not going to believe me because, I can force myself into that neurotypical mold for a short period of time, but then it will all fall apart at some point and I will feel the cost of that. So yeah, I think there is definitely a fear of not being believed, or like a shame of not being able to do what everyone else does in the same way, and having to do things differently.
You just said that then about it being, how much what that feels like, and there's a lot that can be said about how it feels, and it can be very, very traumatic and very painful, more so than sometimes people can realize. And you don't want to feel like that, do you, when you go into an environment? I guess if you know you go into an environment where you're going to feel like that, that's just going to compound things, isn't it? And make things more challenging to make you feel motivated to go back into school.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
and I guess it's also really frustrating because you love learning,
Yeah.
and that is the place. And so to also know that that is the place where you'll be able to pursue that love of learning, but you can't get to it because of the way that environment can make you feel. that would frustrate you as well, I guess. Not be
Yeah.
right for us. Yeah. We've had a conversation a few times prior to this, when I mentioned about my daughter, and she was school avoiding, because I don't like using the term school refusal, because I
No.
think that makes it sound like the child's the issue. It's not. It's the environment. So avoiding, I think, is better, because you don't want to go to. You would naturally avoid somewhere you don't want to go. But it's not that you don't want to go. You do. You just can't access it.
Yeah.
And my daughter's she don't mind me talking about this, because she's quite happy with me sharing the story, because she knows this is what motivates, one of the things that motivates what I do. And she found, especially after the pandemic, being in large classrooms with large classrooms, large groups and stuff, was incredibly overwhelming. And things started to go quite wrong. She would have us what corridors can be like in transition between lessons.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she had a set route that she would take to try and navigate her way through a busy corridor. So she was able just to shut herself off and just make a beeline. But one time that access was blocked for a reason, and then a teacher directs her to go round. She can't go round. She's now very overwhelmed and starts to have a meltdown in front of a lot of students. She did eventually get back to a classroom, and in frustration, she threw a board duster across a classroom, and then got shouted at and told off for throwing it at a student. And it's like, it's that sort of level of understanding about distress responses, I think, is particularly when we're dealing with neurodivergent children, really has to be considered before thinking about the whole behavior management things, and viewing behavior as a sign of unmet need. But from her perspective, though, she didn't want to go back because she just felt that she wasn't learning. She loves learning too.
Yeah.
And she just and she didn't want to go back at all. So
Yeah.
I mean, just bringing it back to yourself. So when you took time out of school, what was it like to try and get back in?
I think it was difficult, especially obviously as you progress further and further into like GCSE years as well. There's so much content crammed into like the academic year that, you know, if you do something once in lesson and you don't go over it again because you've got a whole other 3 books or whatever to get through, or all the rest of the curriculum. So I think I was lucky in that, you know, I was able to manage that quite well. And, you know, my friends would send me what they'd done and I'd be able to sort of have a look at it on my own at home. I think it definitely was easier in subjects that were like my subjects and that I was interested in and that I found easy. You know, it was there was never ever an issue with subjects like English, which play into like my special interests and things like that, because, you know, I loved looking at it at home and doing that. It was subjects where I struggled more, like maths and things like that, where, you know, coming back felt really daunting because I would not have, I'd be behind and the teacher would, you know, have to spend time teaching me what everyone else had already done, you know, last week. And a lot of the time, you know, when I'd be getting upset and stressed about being behind, you know, the answer from the school is obviously, well, you need to be in school more, and this wouldn't happen, which, you know, I know, like, it's very easy to look back on things in retrospect as an adult and feel like, you know, well, it's not that simple, and there were other things in play. But at the time, it does definitely contribute to like those feelings of like blame and things like that. And so you're less likely to speak up next time, and you just pretend that you understand it. And, you know, I'm really lucky in that, you know, I had really supportive parents and stuff like that, who, you know, I had a tutor for my subjects that I was really struggling in, like physics and things like that. So I was able to sort of have those like different learning spaces that were created for me at home, either doing things by myself or doing things with a tutor. But obviously a lot of people don't have access to that, and it's not something that in school was necessarily provided. And I think again that all comes down to being undiagnosed. There's no reason for it. Like that's just the way things. There was no reason for it or that anyone knew of. So that's just the way that things go. I think I can see it as well with like my younger brother, who is pursuing a diagnosis for ADHD. Again, as an adult, but he, you know, in school it was the same thing, you know, and it was a vicious circle where he would not be able to focus in class. So then he'd be having behavior problems in class. Then he'd be just sent home from school because he's a troublemaker or whatever that's labeled as. And so then he'd be like, well, what's the point? No one believes me. No one. So he had a very negative mindset about school generally by the time he was finishing up. So yeah, I think it's really interesting seeing the ways that, you know, the similarities between my experience and my brother's experience, but then and also the differences as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's things that can be said that can be far more damaging to you than people sometimes realise. I mean, to say to you when you've returned after a period of absence because of the feelings of overwhelm that you've been having and the fear of returning to this the school environment, to then return and then be told that you should have attended more.
Yeah.
How did that make you feel?
I think definitely it feels it because I already had all those those feelings myself, like, oh well, you're just being lazy, you're just being dramatic, you could actually go to school. Because, you know, I'd wake up in the morning, I'd feel really overwhelmed at the thought of going into school, and I'd feel sick about going into school, and I'd feel horrible, and then I'd stay home, and then after a few hours where I was at home alone listening to my music or reading my book or whatever I was doing, or just doing work on my own in my room, I'd feel fine because, you know, that's a suitable environment. So I'd feel fine, and then I'd convince myself, oh well, you're just making it up, you're just pretending. So because you've already got those feelings yourself, you know, any sort of comments like that from the school definitely contribute to that as well and feed into that that mindset of, again, you know, shame and yeah, that kind of negative response.
So it's like it starts off with this whole you're feeling overwhelmed, and then you're out to try and sort of take some time out from that. Then that fear starts to develop about going back in. Then you go back in, and then it's past comment about you being absent, and then which makes you feel like what you're doing. And if I heard that right, it's kind of now you're having to deal with the thoughts of feeling judged.
Yeah, I think so.
And you know, so it's compounding all these things about how we think as neurodivergent individuals as well, because of the way we perceive things. It can be very different to what other people can perceive, and sometimes in the sort of school, especially in school avoidance, it can be much more complicated than people can really think. But one thing that, again, drawing upon my daughter's situation, stuff, environment makes a big difference, and if the you know, if the school could look back and think about sort of what's causing these absences, which I know a lot of schools do, so it's not about bashing everybody at all. It's just like some of these experiences are really important to listen to, and I think that sort of trying to reassure an individual that things have improved in the environment that they're in, you know, can make a big difference in reducing that anxiety, because it does come to anxiety, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And anxiety levels, it's like, if you think of it like a jar, it's just filling that anxiety level. So you're starting off about the overwhelm, then the fear of returning to that overwhelm, and then the fear of being judged. It's just raising this big jug of anxiety. And I read once about sort of the impact on that anxiety has on working memory, and because of our working memory, and many neurodivergent people are dyslexic, as well. And so, when you think of that jug is working memory, the amount of anxiety that's raising that jug is eating the working memory, not leaving you much left to do the learning, to use your working memory to do the learning. So it's, I think there's a lot to say about removing those barriers, and some of that is about how the environment's approached, understanding that that overwhelm is absolutely okay to feel overwhelmed, but it's not okay to not do something about it as a professional. You've got to do something about it, otherwise you start getting all these feelings that start to increase. I've waffled a bit there.
Sorry, I think it's like the same way with the working memory stuff. Like, I think masking has a very similar effect, because if I'm sat in a classroom with 30 other kids, all of my mental energy is going into, is my face in a normal position? Like, is that person that's whispering over there talking about me? Have I done something weird? Like, all these, like, trying to tune out the sound of, the printer going off in the back of the classroom, trying to, like, hold myself in an appropriate position, and make, like, eye contact with the teacher so that they know that I'm listening, and all this, like, all these little things that, people do without thinking, when they're neurotypical. But it can be really, really difficult when you're not, and all of my mental energy will be going towards that. And it still happens now, like, as an adult, I'll be in a meeting and I'll be really focusing on making sure that I'm, like, active listening and, like, nodding, and then I'll suddenly realize, oh, I have no idea what they just said. And I think it's a similar thing in the classroom, trying to, like, eliminate that as much as possible, and having a space where it's safe to unmask is that will again help with working memory, because it's like a million fewer things to have to focus on and concentrate on, so you can just focus on the learning.
Yeah, so understanding about the effects that all this overwhelm and any fears of being judged, and the effort that it takes to mask, can then sort of result to that working memory jug overflowing, which is when we hit the burnout. And it makes you think, why would you want to go into an environment where that's going to happen, leaving yourself with very little working memory to do the learning? I mean, it's great to hear that friends of yours are sending you the work that you were doing and things, so you were able to do the learning in the safe space of your own home. And how did that feel when friends were sending you that material?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good, because also that, if when I'm sat at home, and I've not been able to go into school, I am sort of, I did feel very conscious, and I'd be feeling very anxious about the fact that, I'm going to be behind, and what they're doing in maths today, and I'm going to have to catch up next time, and I'm going to be doing different work to everyone else. And, it's not something that you don't think about. It was always on my mind. And so for when my, like, friends would send me the work, or they'd like tell me what they've been doing so that I could have a quick look online, it does help alleviate a lot of that anxiety. And again, that will help me feel more able to get in next time, potentially.
No, that's good, because that then takes away, like you're saying, that fear of falling behind and things. And and you've got some good friends there, seriously, that are thinking about that, and yeah, which is fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing that experience. Because I think it's really important to get an idea from somebody who has experienced that school avoidance, and how how does school avoidance occur for the individual who's avoiding going to school? Because hopefully that'll shed some sort of information that's educators could use to sort of think about their own kids that they have, and if there's any kids in their schools who are avoiding going into school. So we'll move on now a bit more about your journey since. So when you discovered that you're neurodivergent, what did you mostly learn about yourself?
Yeah, I think because I think I've mentioned I wasn't diagnosed until I'd already left school and been through like the whole education system. I first started to sort of suspect that I was neurodivergent when I was at university. I was it was kind of twofold. I was doing some research for my dissertation, and my dissertation filling my linguistics degree was on, prosodic phrasing patterns in autistic speakers and versus neurotypical speakers. And me not realizing that I was autistic the whole time I was doing it, just like, oh, this is really interesting. But as part of that, I had to do a lot of research into autism, and especially to make sure my sample was unbiased. I had to do research into the differences between like men versus women with autism and all that kind of thing. I think before that, I'd had like a very narrow stereotypical view of what autism was, in like the stereotypical young boy who likes trains and like that very narrow reference point that a lot of people have and that I had too. So doing that research was part of it. And then also I was a tutor while I was at university. I was a tutor in schools for many pupils. Many of my pupils were neurodivergent in various ways. And I think working with those pupils, I was recognizing a lot of their experiences felt really similar to mine in terms of the way that they felt in school and all those sort of challenges that they were having. So that sort of led me to me doing a lot more research and ending up getting first a diagnosis of ADHD and then a diagnosis of autism shortly afterwards when I was in my 20s. So I think getting that was such a light bulb moment for me. I did so much reevaluating of my own life and of myself, and I'm still constantly understanding more and more about me and my uniqueness. I think that in terms of what I've learned about myself, I think an ongoing thing is still trying to learn to unmask and to recognize when things are burning me out and using up too much of my energy. That's still a big challenge for me. But when I'm sort of learning constantly, I feel like every time that I am masking, I'm just expending huge amounts of energy on like putting forward this like more palatable version of myself to make it easier for neurotypical people to understand me. But it comes obviously at a very great cost to my own well-being. I think it's challenging as well because it's not as easy as just choosing to unmask. I'm going to be unmasked now because there's negatives either way, because I can make a conscious effort to unmask, but that still will then cause me anxiety about the way that others are perceiving me, and being very aware of the fact that I'm different to other people and worrying that they won't understand that. So there are still situations, a lot of situations where I do put on the mask and just build in time to recover from that, because you kind of have to. I think that a lot of people still don't understand, the breadth of neurodiversity that exists, and so it can feel really isolating to be your authentic self if you've been consistently misunderstood your whole life. It's hard to kind of ignore that and put that to one side just overnight. I think I'm definitely learning more about my strengths, which are intrinsically, linked to my neurodivergence. I'm, really logical, and I'm a great planner and organizer, which has made me feel really confident in like my work going into the working world and my career. When it's something that I'm passionate about, which my job is. You know, I can hyper focus like nobody's business and be really productive. I think working in the education sector, or the third sector, but within education, my own experience has made me really aware of some of the barriers that lots of our students are facing, and also very aware that a lot of them won't have a diagnosis or be receiving support that they need. So I think that's one of the main things, learning all these things about myself. I'm also learning them potentially for other people, and being very, very aware of that in sort of every aspect of my life.
So it's really, really fantastic. There's a lot of things you're saying there that resonates with me and my diagnosis as well. Did you find that when you discovered that you're autistic, did you find that actually it's not just about explaining why things were challenging, but actually explains why I'm good at certain things, or why
Yes,
you're good at certain
definitely.
things?
Yeah,
Yeah, and
100%.
it's kind of it's validating.
Yeah, it is.
And it's not, a diagnosis of being autistic isn't a negative in my
No.
view, because I just find that it answers a lot of questions,
Yeah.
both challenges as well as strengths.
Well, it's also so validating because, you know, if you spent your whole life thinking that, you know, you're just weird and you just don't fit in, and, you know, or you're just lazy, you're just sensitive, or whatever that is. For me, that getting that diagnosis was like almost like proof from someone other than myself that, like, no, like there's a reason for this, and this is why. And you can kind of start to address some of those feelings that you've had about yourself and rethink them, which is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And you tend to know then as well where to position yourself by using your strengths, and to do some pretty amazing things. And just one last question now, really. So if you had a time machine and you went back in time, what advice would you give to schools that could make the educational experience better for neurodivergent children?
Yeah, so I think for me, one of the key things is better training for all staff, and up to date training on neurodiversity and neurodivergence. And the many, many different ways that pupils can learn and can process and can appear in the classroom and exist in the classroom, from, you know, the people who are neurotypical to, you know, autistic students, or students with ADHD, or students with dyslexia, or all of this broad spectrum of neurodivergence that also exists alongside neurotypical learners. I think it's really important that that kind of training is done from an intersectional, like through an intersectional lens. You know, it's so often marginalized groups that are the ones that go undiagnosed and that are unable to access support, because a lot of people might think that they have an understanding of what, you know, autism looks like, but they might have a very narrow scope for that in terms of a very stereotypical view. So I think the training is really, really important for all staff who interact with pupils. I think early identification is obviously key, but we have to be aware that in the current state of this country, a diagnosis is not something that's accessible for a lot of people. There are waiting lists that are years and years and years. Doesn't change the fact that a person is still neurodivergent before they receive that diagnosis. They will still need the support in the 5 years they're waiting for someone to confirm that. So that's why it's really important, you know, as we've already said, to sort of evaluate and create like neuro-inclusive and neuro-affirming, like whole school approaches. Little fixes that are so easy, like making sure all teachers know the importance of like really clear, comprehensive instructions that can be sort of written down and referred back to, rather than just heard verbally. Building in processing time during lessons, when questions are asked, you know, creating safe, quiet spaces and signposting students to them so that, you know, any pupil can access that if they're feeling overwhelmed. They shouldn't need to have, a diagnosis of something and have it written on an official plan. That should be spaces that should be open to all students, really, because then those who don't have a diagnosis can make the most of that as well. I think there's so much to be said for assistive technology and how much that's developing. That can be such an amazing tool to aid learning and to diversify teaching methods. I use AI all the time in my work life, and it sort of helps me structure things. And it's I think there's a lot to be said for how that can be used to kind of help students who might sort of but ultimately I think a lot of teachers and a lot of senior leaders and a lot of schools individually are doing the right things. At a national level, our schools are understaffed, they're underfunded. So it's more important than ever for schools to prioritise these whole school approaches and embed inclusive practice in day-to-day running for all staff and all students, rather than just for individual pupils after a lengthy assessment process. I think it's also really important to include the voices of pupils in these decisions as well, and have like a clear way for pupils to give feedback on what works in school and what doesn't work in school, and be able to be part of that conversation, because their experience, they're the ones that are there to learn, and their experiences are really important. And it's only by asking and having a clear way for them to know that they can sort of suggest things that you're going to get the suggestions that are going to be most useful to the learners.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head for the argument for a universal design principles there, which is really, really good. And then as well, you mentioned AI. AI is a game changer, for particularly for us neurodivergent folk. And I'm really pleased that we have got one of our sessions is talking about artificial intelligence and its potential.
I'm going to be watching that one.
Oh yes, so I'm not presenting that one, but I'm very much looking forward to listening to it, because for me, I use AI as well to help me with the difficulties, largely around my dyslexic traits. So it's an absolute game changer. It really is. Superb. Thank you very much for sharing your experience, your life experience, and what it was like to be a student. I mean, one last thing just popped in my head now. Absolutely, I think training is definitely important, but I think it's also really important to emphasize that it doesn't just stop there.
Yeah.
It's got to be, the training is great for like awareness building, but as within education, it is fast moving. No 2 days are the same, and so much happens. It's very easy to lose that knowledge very quickly, because of the day to day, what it's like to work in education. So it is something that can, it's got to be planned as a strategy, really. And like you say, schools are under a lot of pressure financially, staffing, and so on, but they can try to work with what they've got. And it is a whole school approach. It's all children, because that's the whole point of the neurodiversity paradigm, is that it's about all ways of thinking. So it's not just neurodivergent children. You've got your neurotypical too. Yeah. And if you have a whole school approach to be much more neurodiversity affirming, then that in itself should raise the quality of teaching and learning, and therefore outcomes. It's an endeavour worth doing. It really is. So what's just to finish off on something back. All right, you're still in your time machine. What would you have said to your younger school age self, knowing what you know now?
I think I would have, really stressed to her that the way that you are feeling is not the way that you should be feeling all the time. You should not feel this drained. You should not feel this, alone, and this, anxious all the time. The things that you feel you need to do to look after yourself, that you feel make you lazy or make you sensitive or whatever it may be, that's not the case. They are the things that you need to look after yourself and to um, yeah, look after yourself in an environment that should be looking after you better. So there's many things that I would say to my younger self. I think the first one, I'd want to make her aware that she has autism and ADHD and she's autistic, and you know yeah, I because that was the key to the door for me, really, and like understanding so much more about myself, and it's all cascaded from there. So yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thanks again. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on board for this. And if anyone wants to get in touch with you or want to sort of share experiences with you and things like that, is there a way that they can get in touch?
Yeah, definitely. I can share my email if that's.
And you're in LinkedIn, aren't you?
Oh yes, that's probably better. Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah.
So add you and follow you and see all the really good stuff that you're doing on LinkedIn and the things you're sharing. Really inspiring. So thank you very much, Becky.
Thanks, Simon.